My name is Barbara, and I am 58 years old. As a retired school administrator, I dedicated my entire career to protecting children from bullying, fostering positive environments where every child could flourish. I raised my daughter Lisa with kindness and fairness at the center of everything. When I married Mark, I entered our union with an open heart, believing wholeheartedly in his family's unity, especially trusting his younger brother David. But then, at Thanksgiving dinner, everything shattered. David, my brother-in-law, exploded in rage. He verbally abused Lisa, my precious daughter, for not sharing her iPad, calling her a selfish, spoiled brat. When I instinctively stepped forward to defend her, he turned that vicious fury on me, screaming, "You've ruined your children. You're an unworthy mother. You have no humanity." Mark, my own husband, sat there frozen, paralyzed by fear. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, blamed me entirely. My integrity, my love, my family's peace, all shattered in that moment. I felt utterly alone, disrespected, powerless. Yet as despair threatened to consume me, something awakened. My years as a school administrator had taught me to document everything, to build cases methodically. What David, Eleanor, Mark, and even Lisa didn't know was my secret arsenal meticulous case notes detailing David's bullying history and crucial home security camera footage capturing his vicious abuse, Mark's chilling silence, Eleanor's biased blame, and Lisa's distress. My child psychologist ally was waiting. This time their insidious bullying wouldn't just unravel. It would expose their shocking lack of humanity, compel Mark to defend us and restore emotional safety. But the cost would be agonizing. The days following that Thanksgiving disaster felt like walking through a minefield. Every breath seemed to echo with David's cruel words. Every silence from Mark felt like another small betrayal. I knew I had to try, had to believe that reason could still prevail in this family I'd loved for so many years. I chose a quiet Sunday morning to approach Mark. He was reading the newspaper in our kitchen, the same spot where we'd shared countless peaceful mornings over the years. I sat across from him, my hands trembling slightly as I poured my coffee. "Mark," I began, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "We need to talk about what happened at Thanksgiving, what David did to Lisa. It wasn't acceptable." Mark barely looked up from his paper. "Barbara, let it go. That's just David being David. You know how he gets." Just David being David, as if cruelty was simply a personality trait we should all accommodate. "Mark, our daughter was terrified. She's been having nightmares since then. This isn't about David's personality. This is about protecting our child." Before Mark could respond, I heard Eleanor's voice from the doorway. She'd let herself in with her spare key, as she often did. "Barbara," I couldn't help but overhear. "Are you still going on about this? David was absolutely right to put that child in her place." I felt my chest tighten. "Eleanor, he called Lisa selfish and spoiled. He screamed at her for not sharing her iPad. She's only 12 years old." Eleanor settled into the chair beside Mark, her presence immediately shifting the dynamic. "Barbara, you've always been too soft with that girl. David was trying to teach her some manners, something you clearly haven't done. You're breaking this family apart with your defiance." The word defiance hit me like a slap. Defiance. For protecting my daughter from verbal abuse, for expecting basic human decency. Within hours, my phone buzzed with a text from David. "Stay out of my family business, or you'll regret it. This is how we handle things. Eleanor agrees with me. You're outnumbered." I stared at that message, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't about family unity or tough love. This was about control. David viewed every family gathering as his domain to rule, demanding absolute obedience, threatening consequences if anyone dared challenge his authority. I tried once more with Mark that evening. Mark, you saw how terrified Lisa was. No child deserves that kind of treatment. This isn't about being too sensitive. This is about basic human decency and protecting our daughter. Mark's response was a mumbled apology, his eyes avoiding mine. I'm sorry, Barbara. I know David can be intense, but he's family. We have to find a way to work through this. As if David's cruelty was simply a logistical problem to be solved, rather than a fundamental assault on our family's safety and dignity. The next day, Sarah David's wife made her own contribution to my humiliation. I overheard her talking to our mutual cousin at the grocery store. Barbara's just too dramatic, she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of dismissive superiority. She thinks everyone needs a safe space. It's pathetic, really. Some people just can't handle real family dynamics. Safe space. She said it like it was something ridiculous, something weak people invented to avoid reality. Not a basic human need for respect and emotional safety. David's campaign of intimidation escalated quickly. He began sending demanding texts, insisting I apologize to him and Eleanor for causing trouble. When I didn't respond, he started showing up unannounced at our home. I'd see him through the window standing in our driveway, his cold gaze scanning our house. When Lisa was playing in the yard, he'd stare at her with that same calculating expression he'd worn at Thanksgiving. Barbara, Eleanor said during one of these visits, you need to mend fences for the family's sake. David is trying to be gracious, but you're making it very difficult. Gracious. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. There was nothing gracious about a grown man terrorizing a 12-year-old girl. Nothing gracious about the systematic campaign to isolate and humiliate me for the crime of protecting my daughter. But what broke my heart most was Mark's silence. Each time David showed up, each time Eleanor made her cutting remarks, each time Sarah spread her poison, Mark said nothing. He'd disappear into his study or suddenly remember urgent errands. The man I'd married, the man I'd trusted to stand beside me through anything, had become a ghost in his own home. That night, as I lay in bed listening to Mark's carefully regulated breathing, I realized something had shifted inside me. The devastating shock was hardening into something else, something colder, something more determined. They wanted me to apologize for protecting my daughter. They wanted me to accept David's cruelty as normal family behavior. They wanted me to disappear quietly, to stop causing trouble by expecting basic human decency. But I was a school administrator. I'd spent my entire career protecting children from bullies. I'd built cases, documented patterns, stood up to parents and administrators who enabled abuse. I knew how these people operated. I knew their tactics, and I knew something they didn't know I knew. David's confidence grew bolder with each passing day. He began making public declarations about Lisa announcing to anyone who would listen that she was off limits for any future family interaction unless I corrected my behavior. The message was clear: fall in line or lose your granddaughter forever. His social media posts became increasingly hostile, though carefully crafted to avoid direct accusations. Photos of family gatherings I wasn't invited to, captions about toxic people and drama queens who disrupt family peace. Anyone who knew our family could read between the lines. I was being painted as the unstable troublemaker, the unhinged woman who couldn't accept reasonable family dynamics. The isolation was working. Old friends began avoiding me, unsure what to believe. Neighbors who'd known me for years started giving me those carefully neutral smiles that said they'd heard things, ugly things, and didn't want to get involved. But it was Eleanor's phone call that finally revealed the true depth of their cruelty. I was in my kitchen trying to focus on preparing dinner when I heard Eleanor's voice drifting through the thin walls from next door. She was talking to someone, her tone animated and satisfied. "David finally put her in her place," she was saying. "Barbara always thought she was so smart, so superior with her fancy education and her administrator job. Now everyone sees she's just a meddling old woman. It's best she stays away for everyone's sake. The family is so much more peaceful without her constant drama." The casual cruelty in her voice hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just favoritism toward David. This was deliberate, calculated malice. Eleanor wanted me gone, wanted me erased from this family I'd loved and served for decades. But the truly devastating irony was what Eleanor had forgotten, or perhaps what she'd never truly understood. The secret I'd carried for over 20 years, the sacrifice I'd made to save her very life. It was 1998. Eleanor was drowning in debt from a gambling addiction she'd hidden from everyone, including Mark and David. $180,000 in debt, with creditors circling, and criminal charges for tax fraud looming. She was desperate, terrified, facing prison and public disgrace. I was the only one who knew. Eleanor had broken down in my kitchen one night, sobbing and shaking, begging me not to tell Mark. "Barbara, please," she'd whispered. "I can't go to prison. I'll lose everything. My boys will be so ashamed." I'd held her that night, this woman who was now orchestrating my destruction, and I'd made a promise. I liquidated my entire personal savings, over $70,000, that Mark and I had been saving for Lisa's college fund. I used every contact in my professional network to quietly pay off Eleanor's creditors. I even falsified financial records to create a paper trail that would satisfy the tax authorities, risking my own career and reputation. It took me 3 years to rebuild our savings, 3 years of working double shifts and taking on extra consulting work. Mark never knew why our college fund had mysteriously stagnated. I told him the market was down, that we'd had some unexpected expenses. I'd saved Eleanor from prison, from public humiliation, from losing her son's respect, and she'd thanked me with tears in her eyes, swearing she'd never forget what I'd done for her. Now, listening to her gleeful destruction of my reputation, I felt something crack inside my chest. The woman I'd risked everything to protect was leading the charge to destroy me. When I tried to speak to Eleanor privately, to remind her subtly of our shared history, she cut me off with vicious efficiency. "Barbara, you're always trying to play the martyr. Your past choices are your own business. David says you're just trying to manipulate us with old stories. We're not interested in your guilt trips." Old stories. 20 years of keeping her secret, of protecting her dignity, reduced to manipulation and guilt trips. But David wasn't finished with his campaign. He'd enlisted his son Ethan, my own grandson, in his psychological warfare. During a family gathering, I wasn't invited to. Ethan had been coached to publicly point at me and laugh whenever my name was mentioned. "Grandma's so clumsy. She can't even stand still. She's crazy." The words of a child, but delivered with the calculated cruelty of his father. Then came the legal documents, a formal letter from Mr. Smith David's lawyer arriving by certified mail. The language was cold and professional, but the message was clear: submit completely or face total destruction. The proposal was diabolical in its thoroughness. If I would sign a binding agreement, permanently relinquishing all attempts to contact Lisa, agree to a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation designed to prove my incompetence and publicly apologize for causing discord, they would graciously agree not to pursue a full restraining order. As a gesture of goodwill, they might even allow me supervised contact with Ethan once a year. I read that letter 3 times before the full horror sank in. They weren't just trying to silence me. They were trying to legally brand me as mentally unstable to create a permanent record that would follow me forever. The psychiatric evaluation would be conducted by a doctor of their choosing, the results predetermined. It was designed to break me completely, to make me complicit in my own destruction. That night I sat in my kitchen with the letter spread before me, feeling the weight of their betrayal settling into my bones. Eleanor, whom I'd saved from prison. Mark, whom I'd protected from scandal. David, whom I'd welcomed into my home countless times. They wanted me to disappear, to accept their version of events, to become the crazy old woman they'd painted me as. They wanted me to sign away my rights to my own daughter and accept crumbs of contact with my grandson. But I was still Barbara, the school administrator who'd spent her career protecting children from bullies. I still had my documentation, my evidence, my network of allies, and I still had secrets they didn't know I knew. The fire that had been building in my chest wasn't despair anymore. It was something much more dangerous, or it was the cold, righteous anger of someone who'd finally seen the true face of the people she'd loved and sacrificed for. They thought they knew me. They thought they could manipulate me with fear and legal threats and public humiliation. They had no idea what they'd awakened. The formal expulsion came on a Tuesday morning that dawned gray and cold, as if the weather itself was reflecting the darkness that had settled over my life. I was in my kitchen trying to find some normalcy in the simple act of making coffee when I heard the certified mail truck in our driveway. My hands trembled as I signed for the thick envelope from Mr. Smith's law firm. Inside was a document that made my blood run cold, a temporary restraining order, officially approved by the court based on allegations of emotional harassment and obsessive behavior related to our family dispute. The language was carefully crafted to sound reasonable, professional, but the reality was devastating. I was now legally prohibited from coming within 500 feet of David, Eleanor, or my grandchildren. Any attempt to contact them directly or indirectly would make me a criminal subject to immediate arrest. They'd done it. They'd actually done it. With a few carefully worded lies and the testimony of concerned family members, they'd managed to brand me as a dangerous person in the eyes of the law. But what followed was even more crushing than the legal documents. I spent the next 3 days in a state of numb shock, trying to process the enormity of what had happened. By Thursday, I knew I had to try one last time. If they wouldn't listen to reason, if they wouldn't respond to love, maybe they'd respond to memory. I spent hours that day creating something precious, a small photo album filled with our happiest moments together. Lisa's first steps captured in our living room, with Eleanor clapping in the background. Family Christmas mornings with everyone gathered around our tree. Eleanor's birthday parties where she'd always insisted I make her favorite cake. Ethan's first day of school with me beaming proudly beside him. Each photo was a testament to the love we'd shared, the bonds we'd built over decades. I wrote a heartfelt letter to accompany the album, pouring my heart onto the page. To my beloved family, I know we're going through a difficult time, but I want you to remember the love we've shared. These photos represent the best of who we are together. Lisa, you are the light of my life. Eleanor, you've been like a mother to me. Mark, you are my heart. I believe we can find our way back to each other. All my love, always, Barbara. I left the album anonymously at Mark's office, hoping it would reach him when he was alone, when he might be able to see past the poison David had been spreading. For 2 days, I waited. I imagined Mark opening the album, seeing our history together, remembering the woman he'd married instead of the monster they'd painted me as. I imagined Eleanor flipping through the photos, maybe even crying a little, as she remembered the bond we'd once shared. Instead, I found my answer on social media. Sarah David's wife had posted a photo that made my heart stop. There was my carefully crafted album torn and cut to pieces, scattered across what looked like a garbage can. The beautiful photos I'd spent hours selecting, the memories I'd treasured, reduced to colorful scraps of paper. Her caption was the final knife twist, cleaning out the clutter. Some people just can't let go of the past, moving forward from negativity and desperate attempts to manipulate. Toxic people. Moving on. Family first. I stared at that photo until my eyes burned, trying to process the cruelty of it. Those weren't just photos she'd destroyed. They were pieces of my heart memories, of my life's most precious moments, evidence of love that had once been real. But the most devastating realization was that Mark had to have been involved. The album had been delivered to his office. He would have seen it first, which meant he'd either participated in its destruction or allowed it to happen. My own husband, the man who'd held me on our wedding day and promised to love me forever, had stood by while they tore up the visual history of our life together. That night, David sent me a text message that arrived like a final nail in the coffin of my old life. Consider this closed, Barbara. You lose. Don't contact us again. Ever. You're causing too much trouble with your bitterness. Bitterness. As if my heartbreak over losing my family was just petty resentment. Eleanor, not to be outdone, began calling mutual acquaintances with a carefully crafted story about my mental instability and obsession with control. I started receiving concerned calls from friends who'd heard I was having some kind of breakdown and becoming obsessed with the family. The final blow came from Ethan, my own grandson. During a visit to a mutual friend's house, he'd loudly announced, "Grandma's crazy. Why doesn't she just die already?" The words of a child, but clearly coached by adults who wanted to destroy me completely. That night, sitting in my living room surrounded by the ghosts of my former life, I knew I had to tell someone the truth. I called Dr. Sarah Chen, the child psychologist I'd worked with for years, the one person I trusted completely. "Sarah," I said, my voice breaking, "I need to tell you something I've never told anyone." What came out was the deepest, most guarded secret of my life. The truth about Mark, the man I'd loved and protected for over 20 years. In 1995, Mark had been caught embezzling $250,000 from the school district where I worked. He'd been gambling, making increasingly desperate bets to cover his losses, and had started falsifying expense reports and redirecting funds meant for special education programs. The investigation was closing in. Mark was facing criminal charges, prison time, and complete professional ruin. Our marriage was new. Lisa was just a baby, and I was watching the man I loved fall apart before my eyes. I made a choice that would define the rest of my life. Using my position as a school administrator, I created an elaborate cover-up. I falsified documents, created fake vendor contracts, and manipulated accounting records to make it appear that the missing money had been spent on legitimate educational programs. I used my professional reputation and network of contacts to redirect the investigation away from Mark. But the most devastating part was the personal cost. I secretly paid $100,000 in restitution, liquidating my retirement savings and taking out loans that would take me years to repay. I did it all to protect Mark, to save our family, to keep Lisa from growing up with a father in prison. Mark never knew the full extent of what I'd done. I told him I'd managed to clear up the misunderstanding and that he was safe. He'd been so relieved, so grateful, promising he'd never gamble again, that he'd spend the rest of his life making it up to me. And I'd kept that secret for 25 years. through every argument, every difficult moment in our marriage, every time I'd been tempted to throw his past in his face, I'd stayed silent. I'd protected him completely, sacrificing my own financial security and professional integrity to save him. Now, as I sat in my empty house, legally prohibited from seeing my own grandchildren, listening to my husband's family destroy my reputation, I felt the bitter irony of it all. The man I'd saved from prison couldn't even speak up to defend me from his brother's cruelty. The woman I'd saved from bankruptcy was leading the charge to destroy me. The family I'd sacrificed everything to protect had cast me out like a diseased stranger. But as I finished telling Sarah the truth, I felt something shift inside me. The crushing weight of shame and humiliation was transforming into something else, something harder, something more dangerous. They'd underestimated me. They thought they knew my secrets, my weaknesses, my breaking point. They had no idea what I was truly capable of. The broken woman they'd created was about to become their worst nightmare. The days following my devastating conversation with Dr. Chen felt like descending into a psychological prison of my own making. Every morning, I'd wake up in my empty house, surrounded by the silence that had once been filled with Mark's presence, with family dinners, with the sounds of a life I'd built and protected for decades. The weight of my secrets had become unbearable. Mark's embezzlement, Eleanor's gambling debts, 25 years of carefully guarded sacrifices that now felt like chains around my neck. I'd built my entire adult life around protecting these people, and that very foundation had become the source of my destruction. My training as a school administrator had always been my anchor. I was the woman who documented everything, who approached problems methodically, who never let emotions cloud my judgment. But now, staring at the restraining order that legally branded me as dangerous, I felt my sense of reality crumbling. Had I been wrong all these years? Was I the problem they all claimed I was? The isolation was suffocating, but what came next was even worse. Mr. Smith-David's lawyer had been busy. I started receiving concerned calls from former colleagues, people I'd worked with for decades. The messages were always carefully worded, but the underlying message was clear. Someone had been spreading rumors about my mental state. Barbara Honey, said Margaret, a former principal I'd mentored. I got a call from someone expressing concern about you. They mentioned you might be experiencing some cognitive issues, some problems with emotional regulation around children. The blood drained from my face. What exactly did they say, Margaret? Well, they mentioned that you'd been displaying erratic behavior, that there were concerns about your ability to maintain appropriate boundaries with students. They suggested I might want to distance myself from any professional recommendations I'd given you. My reputation, built over 30 years of dedicated service to children, was being systematically destroyed. Phone calls were made to school administrator associations, to child welfare organizations, to community groups where I'd volunteered. Each conversation was subtle, carefully crafted to sound like genuine concern rather than malicious gossip. We're just worried about Barbara, the callers would say. She seems to be having some difficulties with family relationships, some issues with accepting boundaries. You know how these things can escalate in older adults. Within weeks, I was quietly removed from advisory boards, uninvited from conferences, dropped from consulting projects. The academic and professional community that had been my second family for decades began treating me like a pariah. Emails went unanswered. Invitations stopped coming. Former colleagues would cross the street to avoid talking to me. The financial pressure was mounting too. The legal fees from defending myself against David's restraining order were draining my savings. Eleanor had filed a defamation lawsuit, claiming I damaged her reputation by spreading false rumors, about her family. My retirement accounts were being frozen, pending investigation into my mental competency. Then came the eviction notice. Without my pension, without my consulting income, I couldn't afford the mortgage on the home Mark and I had shared for 20 years. The house where I'd raised Lisa, where I'd hosted countless family gatherings, where I'd dreamed of growing old with my husband. The foreclosure proceedings were swift and merciless. A public auction was scheduled for my remaining possessions. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd accumulated over a lifetime of service would be sold to cover debts created by defending myself against false accusations. But the cruelest blow was yet to come. David and Sarah had orchestrated what they called a family harmony event, a charity fundraiser for a local counseling center. The local newspaper covered it extensively, featuring photos of the whole family looking united and happy. In the center of the coverage was a photo that stopped my heart. Ethan, my 10-year-old grandson, standing at a podium, giving a speech about brave parents who protect their children from difficult people. His words were clearly rehearsed, his expressions serious, as he spoke about the importance of healthy boundaries and moving away from negativity. Beside the article was a reproduction of a drawing by Chloe, my 8-year-old granddaughter. It showed a happy family holding hands under a rainbow with the words, "My happy family," written in her careful child's handwriting. Every family member was there, David, Sarah, Ethan, even Eleanor, but there was no grandmother in the picture, no Barbara. I stared at that drawing until my vision blurred with tears. These children whom I'd held as babies, whom I'd read bedtime stories, to whom I'd taught to ride bikes and bake cookies, had been turned into weapons against me. They'd been coached to erase me from their concept of family, to present my absence as a positive thing. That night, sitting in my nearly empty house with boxes packed around me, I seriously considered giving up. What was the point of fighting when everyone I'd ever loved had turned against me? What was the point of holding on to truth when lies had become more powerful? I was contemplating the bottle of sleeping pills in my medicine cabinet when my phone rang. Mrs. Morrison. The voice was unfamiliar, but warm. This is Jennifer Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen. You probably don't remember me, but you were my administrator when I was a student teacher at Roosevelt Elementary. That was 15 years ago. I searched my memory and found her a young woman barely out of college who'd been struggling with a particularly difficult class. I'd spent hours mentoring her, helping her develop classroom management strategies, defending her when a parent complained about her inexperience. "Jennifer," I said softly, "of course I remember you. How are you?" "I'm doing well, thanks to you. I'm a principal now at Madison Elementary." "Mrs. Morrison, I've been following what's happening to you in the news, and I want you to know that I don't believe a word of it. You changed my life. You saved my career when I was ready to quit teaching. I know exactly who you are, and what they're saying about you is a lie." Her words hit me like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. "Mrs. Morrison, I've been talking to some of my colleagues, people whose careers you influenced over the years. We've put together a legal defense fund. We've also connected with a network of retired lawyers who specialize in elder abuse and emotional manipulation cases. We want to help you fight this." I started crying then, deep, shaking sobs of relief and gratitude. In my darkest moment, when I'd been ready to surrender completely the seeds I'd planted decades ago in a young teacher's career, had grown into something that might save me. "There's something else," Jennifer said. "One of the lawyers, Patricia Williams, she says she recognizes the patterns in your case. She thinks there might be criminal charges we can file against David and Eleanor for fraud and conspiracy. Mrs. Morrison, this isn't over. You're not alone. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, hope. Not the naive hope I'd clung to when I thought love and reason could prevail, but something harder, something more dangerous. The fierce determination that had driven me to protect children from bullies for 30 years was awakening again. David and Eleanor thought they'd destroyed me, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd forgotten that I was still Barbara Morrison, the school administrator, who'd never backed down from a fight when children were being hurt. And they'd hurt my children, my grandchildren, turning them into weapons in their cruel game. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The notification came through social media, of all places. A former colleague had tagged me in a post about an upcoming national conference, Student Welfare and Safe School Environments. The keynote speaker was listed as David Morrison, identified as a family wellness advocate and child protection specialist. My hands trembled as I read the description. David, who had never worked a day in education, who had verbally abused my daughter at a dinner table, was being presented as an expert in child welfare. I was living in a homeless shelter, by then having been evicted from my home the week before. The sparse bedroom I shared with 3 other women had a single computer terminal available for residents, and I waited in line for 2 hours to research this conference further. What I discovered made my blood run cold. David hadn't just positioned himself as a keynote speaker. He'd created an entire presentation around a case study that was clearly based on Ethan's experiences, but twisted beyond recognition. The abstract spoke of protecting children from toxic family influences and recognizing the signs of emotional manipulation by trusted authority figures. Eleanor was listed as a co-presenter, her biography describing her as a family advocate with extensive experience in crisis intervention. The woman I'd saved from bankruptcy and prison was now being presented as an expert in family dynamics. But the most devastating part was the promotional video. In it, David spoke earnestly about the importance of recognizing when authority figures abuse their positions of trust. Behind him, photos flashed of school environments, administrators in meetings, children in classrooms. It was a professional-looking presentation that subtly discredited everything I'd spent my career building. Too often, David said to the camera, "We assume that people in positions of authority, particularly in educational settings, have children's best interests at heart. But what happens when those very people become the source of emotional harm, when their methods, however well-intentioned, create unsafe environments for the children they're meant to protect?" The conference was scheduled for the following week. I managed to find a live stream link through the library's computer system, though watching it felt like witnessing my own execution. David took the stage in a perfectly tailored suit, looking every inch the professional expert. He spoke with confidence about outdated disciplinary methods and authoritarian approaches that masquerade as child protection. Every word was a calculated attack on the principles I'd built my career around. I want to share with you today a case study, he said, of a child who was subjected to what appeared to be loving guidance, but which actually constituted a form of emotional abuse. The authority figure in question used their position to create an atmosphere of fear and control, always under the guise of protection. He wasn't just lying about me. He was taking the methods I'd used to protect children from bullies and reframing them as bullying itself. Every intervention I'd made, every time I'd stood up to abusive parents or negligent administrators, was being recontextualized as overreach and emotional manipulation. Eleanor took the stage next, speaking about the importance of family boundaries and recognizing when outside influences become toxic to family harmony. She spoke with practiced emotion about the pain of watching a family member lose touch with reality and the difficult decision to protect the children from further emotional damage. As I sat in that library watching these two people systematically dismantle my life's work, I felt something break inside me that I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. This wasn't just personal vindictiveness anymore. They were using my professional reputation, my decades of service to children, as a weapon in their psychological warfare. But the worst was yet to come. The video screen filled with a familiar face, Ethan, my grandson, sitting in what looked like a counselor's office. He appeared serious, older than his 10 years, as he spoke directly to the camera. "I used to be afraid all the time," he said, his voice steady and rehearsed. "My grandmother, she always wanted to know everything I was doing, always watching, always correcting. She said it was because she loved me, but it didn't feel like love. It felt scary." And my vision blurred with tears as I watched this child, whom I'd taught to ride a bicycle, whom I'd comforted during thunderstorms, describe me as a source of fear rather than comfort. "But now," Ethan continued, "my parents helped me understand that it's okay to have boundaries. It's okay to say no to people who make you feel bad, even if they're family. I feel much safer now." The interviewer's voice came from off camera. "And what would you say to other children who might be experiencing similar situations?" Ethan looked directly into the camera, and I could see David's coaching in every word. "I would say that it's important to trust your parents and the other adults who really care about you. Sometimes people who seem nice can actually be harmful. You have to be brave enough to tell the truth about how they make you feel." When Chloe appeared on screen next, I nearly ran from the library. She was holding up an old student discipline manual, one I'd kept as a reference during my administrative years. "Grandma used to follow this," she said, giggling as she flipped through the pages. "Look how old-fashioned it is. We prefer modern approaches now. The old ways were too strict and scary." The interviewer prompted her, "And how do you feel about these new modern approaches?" "Much better," Chloe chirped. "Everything is more fun now. We don't have to worry about getting in trouble for silly things anymore." They were using my grandchildren to present my entire educational philosophy as outdated, harmful, even abusive. Every principle I'd stood for, every method I'd used to create safe learning environments was being discredited by the very children I'd helped protect and nurture. The conference concluded with David receiving a standing ovation. In the chat comments, I could see educators praising his courage in speaking out against toxic authority figures and expressing gratitude for his eye-opening presentation. But as I sat there in stunned silence, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Mrs. Morrison, this is Dr. Robert Chen, retired superintendent from Highland District. I worked with you on the Stevens case in 2018. I watched that conference presentation and I'm disgusted. That man is lying and I can prove it. I'm writing an affidavit documenting your impeccable ethical record and your genuine commitment to child welfare. This is character assassination and it needs to stop. Please call me." Through my tears, I felt a spark of the old fire. Someone who knew my work, who had seen me in action protecting children, was willing to stand up for the truth. David and Eleanor had made one crucial mistake in their campaign to destroy me. They'd been so focused on manipulating public opinion that they'd forgotten there were people out there who knew the real Barbara Morrison, people who had worked alongside me, who had witnessed my dedication firsthand. As I walked back to the shelter that night, I realized something important. This wasn't just about defending myself anymore. Every lie they told about my methods, every principle they discredited, weakened the protections for vulnerable children everywhere. They turned this into something bigger than personal revenge. They'd made it about the very foundations of child protection and educational ethics, and that was a fight I knew how to win. The final blow came with mathematical precision, timed to destroy what little stability I had left. David's lawsuit arrived by certified mail at the homeless shelter, a thick packet of legal documents that outlined his demand for $1.5 million in damages for emotional distress and reputational harm. The allegations were breathtaking in their audacity. According to the filing, my harassment campaign had caused David severe psychological trauma, requiring extensive therapy and medication. My erratic behavior had damaged his standing in the community and interfered with his business relationships. My obsessive conduct had created an atmosphere of fear that had traumatized his children. Each lie was carefully crafted, supported by doctored text messages and selectively edited recordings. David's legal team had created an alternate reality where I was the aggressor and he was the innocent victim of a deranged woman's vendetta. But the lawsuit was just the opening move. The real devastation came when I received a call from the State Pension Board. Mrs. Morrison, the administrator, said, her voice professionally neutral. "We've received some concerning reports about your conduct during your tenure as a school administrator. There are allegations of financial mismanagement, inappropriate disciplinary actions, and questions about your mental competency to manage your pension benefits." My throat went dry. "What kind of allegations?" "We've been contacted by individuals expressing concern about your ability to handle financial matters responsibly. There are also reports of erratic behavior and potential misconduct in your professional roles. Pending investigation, we're suspending your pension payments and freezing your retirement accounts." David had been thorough. Using Eleanor's network and his newfound reputation as a child welfare advocate, he'd contacted every institution that provided me with financial support, my pension, my retirement savings, my small consulting income, all gone with a few strategically placed phone calls expressing concern about my mental state. The eviction from the shelter came next. Without any income, I couldn't even afford the minimal fees for emergency housing. I found myself on the street with 2 garbage bags containing everything I owned, standing outside the building where I'd once felt grateful to have a bed. Sarah, David's wife, made sure the local news covered my eviction. The story ran with the headline, "Former School Administrator Evicted Amid Mental Health Concerns." The accompanying photo showed me loading my possessions into a grocery cart, looking every inch the homeless woman the headlines suggested I'd become. But Sarah wasn't finished with her humiliation campaign. 3 days after my eviction made the news, the local paper ran a feature story about a generous donation to the school district. David and Sarah had purchased a new student wellness center, a beautiful facility dedicated to counseling and mental health services for children. The dedication ceremony was elaborate with local officials praising the Morrison family's commitment to child welfare. Sarah stood at the podium, radiant in a designer dress, speaking about their family's dedication to protecting children from harmful influences. "This wellness center," she announced, "represents our commitment to creating safe spaces where children can heal from trauma and learn healthy relationship patterns. We believe every child deserves protection from toxic influences, whether they come from strangers or from people they trust." The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. The wellness center had been funded with the proceeds from my foreclosed home money that should have supported my retirement. They'd literally built a monument to their own virtue using the financial foundation they'd stolen from me. In the photos accompanying the article, Ethan stood proudly beside a plaque bearing his name designated as the Ethan Morrison Center for Child Wellness. My grandson, who'd been coached to describe me as a source of fear, now had a building named after him that was dedicated to protecting children from people like me. The physical toll of homelessness was devastating. Living on the streets in winter, surviving on free meals from church kitchens, sleeping in doorways and under bridges, my body began to fail. The stress, the malnutrition, the constant cold and fear all converged into a perfect storm of physical breakdown. I was walking to the library, hoping to use their computers to research legal aid options when the heart attack hit. The pain was immediate and crushing, radiating down my left arm as the world tilted and spun around me. I collapsed on the sidewalk outside the building where I'd once held my head high as a respected educator. The paramedics found me unconscious, with no identification except for a library card in my pocket. In the emergency room, as the doctors worked to stabilize my condition, I drifted in and out of consciousness, my mind retreating into memories that felt safer than reality. I found myself reliving a case from 15 years earlier, a situation I'd handled as a school administrator that I'd somehow suppressed. A wealthy father had been manipulating his daughter's relationship with her mother, using the child as a weapon in a bitter custody dispute. He'd been charming and persuasive, presenting himself as the stable parent while systematically undermining the mother's credibility. I documented the pattern, then recognized the signs of emotional manipulation and parental alienation. I'd fought to protect that child from being used as a pawn in her father's psychological warfare. As the memory became clearer, I realized with horrifying clarity what I was seeing. David's treatment of Ethan and Chloe, his systematic campaign to turn them against me, followed the exact same pattern I'd identified in that long-ago case. He was using textbook manipulation techniques, coaching the children to reject me while making them believe it was their own choice. The man I'd tried to love as a brother-in-law was employing the same tactics I'd spent my career fighting against. Eleanor, who'd positioned herself as a family advocate, was enabling the very kind of emotional abuse I'd trained to recognize and stop. As I lay in that hospital bed, machines monitoring my failing heart, I felt something shift inside me. The revelation gave me a framework for understanding what had happened to me, but more importantly, it gave me the tools to fight back. I wasn't just a victim of family cruelty. I was a case study in systematic emotional abuse and parental alienation. And if there was one thing I knew how to do, it was build a case that would stand up in court. When Jennifer Chen arrived at the hospital, summoned by the emergency contact information I'd given the shelter, she found me weak but determined. "Mrs. Morrison, thank God you're alive. We were so worried when we heard." I gripped her hand with what little strength I had. "Jennifer, I need you to contact Patricia Williams, the lawyer you mentioned. Tell her I'm ready to fight, but this time we're not just defending against their attacks. We're going on the offense." "What do you mean?" "I mean David made a mistake when he started using my grandchildren as weapons. What he's doing to them, what Eleanor is enabling, it's textbook child psychological abuse. And unlike everything else they've done to me that leaves evidence, that leaves witnesses, that leaves a paper trail we can follow." For the first time in months, I felt like I was thinking like a school administrator again, building a case, documenting patterns, protecting children from adult predators who hid behind facades of respectability. David had destroyed my life, but in doing so, he'd exposed himself as exactly the kind of person I'd spent my career fighting against. And now, I had both the motivation and the expertise to destroy him. Recovery from the heart attack was slow and painful, but it gave me time to think, to plan, and to finally see clearly what needed to be done. The hospital's social worker had helped me secure temporary housing in a transitional facility, and for the first time in months, I had a quiet space to process everything that had happened. With Jennifer's help and the growing network of former colleagues who'd rallied to my defense, I'd managed to put together enough evidence to understand the scope of David and Eleanor's conspiracy. But I knew that proving their crimes would require more than documentation. It would require catching them in the act. That's when I decided to make one final appeal to Mark. Using the facility's computer, I carefully crafted a video message that laid out everything I discovered. I detailed David's systematic campaign of emotional manipulation, Eleanor's financial fraud and defamation, and most importantly, the evidence I'd gathered showing how they were psychologically abusing Ethan and Chloe. I spoke directly to the camera, my voice steady, despite the emotional weight of what I was saying. Mark, I know you've been afraid to stand up to David and Eleanor, but you need to understand what they're doing to our grandchildren. This isn't about our marriage anymore, or about family loyalty. This is about protecting innocent children from psychological abuse. I played the audio recordings I'd saved from that first Thanksgiving confrontation, David's vicious verbal assault on Lisa Marks, telling silence Eleanor's immediate defense of the indefensible. I showed documents proving Eleanor's past financial crimes, the ones I'd covered up decades ago to protect her. But most crucially, I revealed the evidence Patricia Williams had helped me gather about David's manipulation of the children. Professional analyses showing signs of coaching in their public statements, documentation of the pattern of parental alienation, expert testimony about the long-term psychological damage such tactics could cause. Mark, I said, looking directly into the camera, I'm not asking you to choose me over your family. I'm asking you to choose our grandchildren over the people who are hurting them. This isn't about me anymore. This is about stopping a cycle of abuse that will scar Ethan and Chloe for the rest of their lives. I ended the video with a revelation I'd never shared with anyone, not even Dr. Chen. The real reason I'd covered up Mark's embezzlement wasn't just love. It was because he'd been gambling away money meant for Lisa's special education needs. My daughter had learning disabilities that required expensive interventions, and Mark had been stealing from those funds to cover his poker debts. I saved you once before, Mark, when you were stealing from our daughter's future. Now I'm asking you to save our grandchildren from people who are stealing their emotional security and their ability to trust. Please, for once in your life, be the man I married instead of the coward you've become. I sent the video through the facility's computer system, routing it through an encrypted email service to Mark's personal account, hoping it would reach him before Eleanor could intercept it. I should have known better. 2 days later, I received a frantic call from Jennifer. Mrs. Morrison, you need to see the news. Turn on Channel 7. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was my video, but it had been edited, manipulated, transformed into something unrecognizable. Background noise had been added to make my voice sound shaky and unstable. Sentences had been spliced together to create statements I'd never made. My measured explanation of David's manipulation had been turned into rambling accusations that sounded like paranoid delusions. The news anchor introduced the segment with barely concealed glee. Tonight, an exclusive look at disturbing video messages sent by a former school administrator to her estranged family. warning some viewers may find this content disturbing. Eleanor had sold my private message to a tabloid news program, but not before having it professionally altered to support her narrative of my mental instability. The legitimate evidence I presented was dismissed as elaborate fantasies, while the manipulated portions were highlighted as proof of my deteriorating grip on reality. But the cruelest part came next. Mark appeared on camera, looking appropriately haggard and concerned. He sat in what looked like a counselor's office with Ethan beside him. My husband spoke with practiced emotion about the painful deterioration of my mental state and the difficult decision to prioritize the children's safety over his loyalty to me. Barbara was once a wonderful woman, he said, his voice breaking in all the right places. But something has changed in her over the past year. The accusations, the conspiracy theories, the inability to accept that people might have legitimate concerns about her behavior. It's been heartbreaking to watch. The interviewer leaned forward sympathetically. This must be especially difficult given your wife's professional background in child welfare. Mark nodded, wiping away what appeared to be a genuine tear. That's what makes it so tragic. Barbara spent her career protecting children, and now we have to protect our grandchildren from her. It's the hardest thing I've ever had to do. Then they turned to Ethan, my 10-year-old grandson, sitting beside his grandfather with the expression of practiced sadness. Ethan, the interviewer said gently, I know this is hard to talk about, but can you tell us how you're feeling about your grandmother? Ethan looked directly into the camera, and I could see David's coaching in every word. I wish Grandma well. He said, his voice small but clear. I hope she gets the help she needs, but I'm glad my family is protecting me from her scary messages and phone calls. Scary messages. Phone calls I'd never made because the restraining order legally prevented me from contacting him. But in the narrative they'd constructed, I was a deranged woman harassing a frightened child. The program concluded with Sarah making a brief appearance, standing beside David in what looked like a press conference setting. She spoke about the importance of believing children when they express fear and the family's commitment to healing and moving forward from this difficult situation. We just want Barbara to get the help she needs, Sarah said, managing to look both compassionate and resolute. But our first priority has to be protecting the children from further emotional trauma. The news segment went viral within hours. Social media exploded with commentary about the deranged grandmother and praise for the family's courage in speaking out. Mental health advocates used my story as an example of how untreated psychological issues could turn elderly people into threats to their own families. But in the midst of this nightmare, something unexpected happened. Dr. Patricia Williams, the lawyer Jennifer had connected me with, appeared on a competing news program the next night. She'd conducted her own analysis of the video footage and had uncovered clear evidence of digital manipulation. What we're seeing here, she told the anchor, is a sophisticated campaign of defamation and elder abuse. This video has been heavily edited with audio tracks added and removed sentences spliced together and background noise artificially enhanced to create an impression of mental instability. She displayed side-by-side comparisons showing the digital alterations' technical analyses, proving the manipulation and expert testimony about the telltale signs of edited media. Moreover, Dr. Williams continued, the pattern of behavior we're seeing from this family matches textbook cases of elder abuse and parental alienation. They've systematically isolated Mrs. Morrison from her support systems, destroyed her financial security, and are now using her own grandchildren as weapons against her. The competing narrative began to gain traction. Other experts weighed in. Forensic analysts confirmed the video manipulation, and former colleagues began speaking publicly about my character and professional integrity. But the damage had been done. In the court of public opinion, I'd been tried and convicted as a mentally unstable woman whose own family had courageously protected their children from her delusions. As I watched the media circus unfold from my small room in the transitional facility, I realized that David and Eleanor had made their most serious mistake yet. By manipulating and selling my private communication, by using my husband and grandson as props in their public relations campaign, they'd created evidence of crimes that went far beyond family disputes. They'd documented their own conspiracy to commit fraud, defamation, and elder abuse. And they'd done it all on national television with witnesses and experts already questioning their version of events. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was looking at the beginning of the end. Not my end, but theirs. The federal courthouse was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds gathering outside to watch the proceedings on screens that had been hastily erected by news crews. What had started as a family dispute had become a national symbol of elder abuse, parental alienation, and the courage it takes to stand up to systematic cruelty. Dr. Patricia Williams and her legal team had assembled an unprecedented case. Using funds from an educational trust I'd established decades earlier and forgotten about, along with donations from former students and colleagues around the country, we'd built a legal fortress that David and Eleanor's lies couldn't penetrate. The charges were extensive criminal emotional abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, defamation, elder abuse, and most importantly, the psychological manipulation of children. The FBI had gotten involved when the scope of the financial crimes became clear, and David was facing serious federal time. But none of that mattered as much as what was about to happen in that courtroom. "Your Honor," Dr. Williams said, approaching the judge's bench, "the defense would like to present Exhibit A unedited audio recordings from the defendant's initial assault on my client and her family." I watched from the witness gallery as she set up the audio equipment. Across the aisle, David sat rigid in his defendant's chair, Eleanor beside him looking pale and shaken. Mark was there too, having been subpoenaed as a witness, his face a mask of barely controlled emotion. The first few seconds were just ambient noise, the sounds of a family dinner winding down. Then Lisa's young voice asking politely if she could finish her homework before sharing her iPad. And then David's voice filled with a rage that had nothing to do with the child's reasonable request. "You selfish, spoiled brat, you disgusting child. You think you're so special, don't you? You think the world revolves around your precious little feelings." The courtroom went dead silent. Even the judge looked shocked at the viciousness in David's tone. This wasn't discipline or correction. This was raw, unbridled cruelty directed at a 12-year-old girl. But it got worse. The recording captured my voice next, steady but protective. "David, that's enough. She's just a child. There's no need to speak to her that way." And then David's explosion, the moment that had shattered my world. "You've ruined your children. You're an unworthy mother. You have no humanity. You've destroyed this family with your pathetic attempts at control." The audio was crystal clear, professionally recorded by the security system I'd installed to protect my home. Every word was audible, every inflection of cruelty preserved for posterity. Then came Mark's voice, or rather his silence. Seconds ticked by with no response, no defense of his wife or daughter, just the sound of his breathing and the scrape of his chair as he physically recoiled from confrontation. Finally, Eleanor's voice cut through the tension. "Barbara, why are you always causing trouble? David is right. You spoil Lisa too much. You're breaking this family apart with your defiance." When the recording ended, The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The jury sat stunned, some wiping away tears. The gallery was motionless, absorbing the reality of what they'd just heard. Dr. Williams let the silence stretch for a long moment before speaking. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just heard is the unfiltered truth, not the carefully crafted narrative presented by the defendants, not the manipulated videos they sold to tabloid programs, but the actual moment when a family's systematic abuse of my client began. Eleanor was called to testify first. As she made her way to the witness stand, I could see her hands shaking. The confident, manipulative woman who'd orchestrated my destruction looked small and fragile under the courtroom lights. Mrs. Eleanor Morrison, the prosecutor began, "You've just heard audio of yourself blaming Mrs. Barbara Morrison for her son-in-law's verbal assault on a child. Can you explain to the jury why you felt that was appropriate?" Eleanor's composure cracked immediately. I was trying to keep peace in the family. David was upset, and Barbara was making it worse by protecting her daughter from verbal abuse. It wasn't abuse, David was he was teaching her manners. Teaching manners by calling a 12-year-old a selfish, spoiled brat and a disgusting child. Eleanor began crying, then not the calculated tears she'd used to manipulate me for years, but ugly, desperate sobs. I don't know why I said those things. I was scared of David too, but I couldn't admit it. I couldn't let anyone see that my own son terrified me. The breakdown was complete and devastating. This woman who'd positioned herself as a family matriarch, who'd built a public persona around wisdom and nurturing, was revealed as someone so broken by her own son's cruelty that she'd enabled his abuse of others rather than face it herself. When David took the stand, the transformation was even more dramatic. The confident, aggressive man who'd terrorized my family was gone, replaced by someone who looked physically diminished by the weight of his exposed cruelty. "Mr. David Morrison," the prosecutor said, "do you recognize your voice on that recording?" David's response was barely audible. "Yes." "And do you stand by those words? Do you believe a 12-year-old child deserved to be called selfish, spoiled, and disgusting for not immediately sharing her iPad?" David broke down completely. His face crumpled, and he began sobbing with the raw intensity of someone whose entire self-image had just collapsed. No, I don't know why I said those things. I was angry. I've been angry for so long, and I took it out on everyone around me. I destroyed my family. I destroyed Barbara. I turned my own children against their grandmother because I was too weak to face my own problems. The sight of this man, who'd seemed so powerful and intimidating, reduced to a broken shell by the truth of his own words, was both satisfying and heartbreaking. This was someone's son, someone's father, and his cruelty had poisoned everyone around him. But the most important testimony came from Mark. My husband approached the witness stand like a man walking to his own execution. 25 years of marriage, 25 years of secrets and protection, and love, all leading to this moment of reckoning. "Mr. Mark Morrison." The prosecutor began, "You were present during the assault we just heard. Why didn't you defend your wife and daughter?" Mark's voice broke on the first word. "Because I was a coward. Because I've been a coward our entire marriage." "Can you elaborate on that?" "Barbara saved me," Mark said, looking directly at me for the first time since this nightmare began. "She saved me from prison, from losing everything, and I repaid her by letting my brother terrorize her. I let my mother humiliate her. I stood by while they destroyed the woman who'd sacrificed everything to protect me." The prosecutor pressed him for details, and Mark told the court everything. The embezzlement, my cover-up, the years of financial sacrifice I'd made to keep his crimes secret. The gambling addiction, the stolen money meant for Lisa's education, all of it. I let fear control me. Mark continued, tears streaming down his face. I was so afraid of David, so afraid of losing my mother's approval, that I chose them over the woman who'd given me everything. I failed as a husband. I failed as a father. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for what I've done. As I watched my husband finally tell the truth, finally stand up for what was right, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year. Not vindication, not triumph, but something deeper. I felt the first stirring of hope that maybe, just maybe, some of what we'd lost could be rebuilt. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, their faces told the story before the foreman even spoke. On the charge of criminal emotional abuse, we find the defendant David Morrison guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendant David Morrison guilty. On the charge of elder abuse, we find the defendant David Morrison guilty. The list went on and on. David sat motionless as his fate was sealed, while Eleanor wept quietly beside him. Sarah, who'd been charged as an accessory for her role in the media manipulation, stared straight ahead with the blank expression of someone whose world had just collapsed. Judge Margaret Chen, no relation to my allies, but a respected federal judge known for her fairness, delivered the sentences with the gravity the crimes deserved. Mr. David Morrison, she said, your systematic campaign of abuse against your sister-in-law represents some of the most calculated cruelty this court has seen. You exploited the trust of children, manipulated vulnerable adults, and used the legal system itself as a weapon against an innocent woman. You are sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. Eleanor received 3 years of probation and significant financial penalties, along with a court order requiring intensive psychological counseling. Sarah was sentenced to community service and required to publicly apologize for her role in the defamation campaign. But more importantly than the sentences was Judge Chen's formal statement clearing my name. This court finds that Mrs. Barbara Morrison has been the victim of a systematic campaign of abuse and defamation. Her character as an educator and advocate for children is beyond reproach. Her actions throughout this ordeal demonstrate extraordinary courage and integrity in the face of unprecedented cruelty. This court hereby formally vindicates Mrs. Morrison's reputation and acknowledges the profound injustice she has suffered. The vindication was complete, and public broadcast lived to millions of viewers who had followed the case. Editorial pages across the country condemned the abuse I'd suffered and praised my courage in fighting back. Support groups for elder abuse victims cited my case as an example of why speaking truth to power matters even when the power comes from within your own family. But for me, the most important moment came later that day when I found myself face to face with Mark in the courthouse hallway. Barbara, he said, his voice hoarse from emotion, I know I don't have the right to ask, but is there any chance you might forgive me? Not now, I know it's too soon, but someday. I looked at this man I'd loved for 25 years, this man who'd failed me so completely when I needed him most, and I saw something I hadn't seen since before David's first attack, genuine remorse and a determination to do better. Mark, I said quietly, forgiveness isn't something I can promise right now, but if you're truly committed to changing, if you're willing to do the work to become the man I thought I married, then maybe we can find a way forward. His relief was palpable. I'll do anything, Barbara. Therapy, counseling, whatever it takes. I want to earn back your trust, even if it takes the rest of my life. The process of rebuilding was slow and painful. Mark moved into a separate apartment and began intensive therapy with a specialist in family dynamics and psychological abuse. We attended counseling sessions together, working through 25 years of hidden resentments and unspoken truths. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments when I wondered if too much damage had been done, times when Mark's old patterns of avoidance and people-pleasing reasserted themselves. But gradually, session by session, conversation by conversation, we began to rebuild something that was stronger than what we'd had before, because it was built on truth instead of secrets. Lisa's healing journey was even more complex. My daughter had to confront not only the trauma of David's abuse and her father's abandonment, but also her own guilt over not standing up for me when the attacks began. "Mom," she said during one of our tearful reconciliation conversations, "I knew what David was doing was wrong, but I was so scared. I didn't want him to turn on me the way he turned on you." I held her while she cried, this grown woman who was still my little girl in so many ways. "Lisa, you were a victim too. David created an atmosphere of fear that paralyzed everyone around him. You don't have anything to apologize for." Lisa threw herself into her own therapy and healing process with characteristic intensity. She joined support groups for families affected by domestic abuse, began volunteering with organizations that help children cope with family trauma, and became one of my fiercest advocates in rebuilding our relationship. But perhaps the most heartbreaking and hopeful conversations were with Ethan and Chloe. My grandchildren had been profoundly damaged by the manipulation they'd endured. David and Sarah had coached them to reject me while making them believe it was their own choice, a form of psychological abuse that left deep scars. The first time Ethan called me after the trial, his voice was small and confused. "Grandma, I think I said some really mean things about you. I don't remember deciding to say them, but everyone told me I did. I'm really confused." Working with child psychologists, we slowly helped the children understand what had happened to them. It was crucial that they not blame themselves for the things they'd been manipulated into saying and doing. They were victims too, caught in the crossfire of adult cruelty. Chloe's healing was even more complicated because she was younger when the manipulation began. In therapy, she drew pictures of her memories, trying to separate what she actually remembered from what she'd been told to remember. "I think I always loved you, Grandma," she said during one of our supervised visits. "But Daddy told me that loving you would hurt Mommy, and I didn't want to hurt Mommy." The slow process of rebuilding trust with my grandchildren was the most delicate work of my life. We had to go slowly, let them set the pace, allow them to process their confusion and guilt in their own time. But gradually, over months and then years, we rebuilt those precious bonds. The children came to understand that loving their grandmother didn't make them disloyal to their parents, that family relationships didn't have to be about choosing sides or proving loyalty through rejection. David's downfall was complete and devastating. The man who'd once seemed so powerful and intimidating was reduced to sending desperate letters from prison, begging for forgiveness and financial help. His marriage to Sarah had collapsed under the weight of criminal charges and public humiliation. His children, once weapons in his campaign against me, now refused to visit him in prison. Eleanor faced a different but equally profound isolation. The community that had once respected her as a family matriarch now saw her as someone who'd enabled abuse and cruelty. She'd lost her social circle, her reputation, and most importantly, the respect of her surviving family members. I felt no joy in their suffering. These were people I'd once loved, people I'd tried to include in my life and my heart. Their destruction was tragic. not triumphant, a reminder of how cruelty ultimately destroys the people who practice it. But I also recognized that their accountability was necessary, not just for my vindication, but for the healing of everyone they'd hurt, including their own children. The legal victory was complete, but the real victory was quieter and more personal. It was Mark slowly earning back my trust through consistent actions instead of empty promises. It was Lisa becoming not just my daughter again, but my partner in helping other families survive similar trauma. It was Ethan and Chloe gradually remembering who their grandmother really was, not the monster they'd been taught to fear, but the woman who'd always loved them unconditionally. Most importantly, it was the gradual return of something I'd thought was lost forever, my sense of safety in my own life. 3 years after the trial ended, I stood in the garden behind my home, watching Ethan and Chloe chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. Mark was grilling hamburgers on the patio, while Lisa set the table for our weekly family dinner, a tradition we'd rebuilt from the ashes of our broken relationships. My house had been fully restored with the settlement money from the lawsuit against David and Eleanor. But more than that, it had become what I'd always intended it to be, a sanctuary of love and safety, a place where family meant protection and support, rather than manipulation and fear. The physical restoration had been the easy part. New furniture to replace what had been sold during my homelessness, fresh paint, to cover the memories of betrayal, a renovated kitchen where we could make new memories around shared meals. But the emotional restoration had taken much longer and gone much deeper. Mark and I had renewed our wedding vows the previous spring, not because we needed to be married again, but because we wanted to make new promises based on truth instead of secrets. The ceremony was small, attended only by Lisa, the grandchildren, and a few close friends who'd supported us through the darkest times. Our relationship was different now, built on a foundation of honesty that we'd never had before. Mark had learned to stand up for what was right instead of what was easy, and I'd learned to trust again, slowly and carefully, but completely. I spent so many years being afraid, Mark had told me during one of our late-night conversations as we rebuilt our marriage. Afraid of David, afraid of disappointing my mother, afraid of facing my own failures. But losing you, watching what my cowardice cost us, taught me that some things are worth fighting for, no matter how scary the fight might be. Lisa had become not just my daughter again, but my closest friend and ally. Together, we'd started a nonprofit organization focused on helping families recover from domestic abuse and parental alienation. Lisa handled the administrative side, while I worked directly with survivors, sharing my story and helping them navigate the complex process of rebuilding shattered relationships. "You know what the most important thing you taught me is," Lisa had said recently. "That love isn't supposed to require you to stay silent about cruelty. Real love gives you the courage to speak truth, even when it's hard." The work we did together was challenging, but deeply fulfilling. We helped other grandparents who'd been alienated from their grandchildren, supported families torn apart by manipulation and control, and educated communities about the warning signs of emotional abuse. My story had become a case study in law schools and social work programs, an example of how systematic abuse can be disguised as family loyalty, and how important it is for institutions to look beyond surface appearances when evaluating claims of elder abuse or mental instability. But perhaps the most rewarding part of my new life was my relationship with Ethan and Chloe. The children had flourished in therapy, learning to process their trauma while rebuilding their capacity for trust and authentic emotion. They spent every weekend with Mark and me, and during school breaks, They often stayed for weeks at a time. "Grandma," Ethan had said to me recently, "I'm writing a report for school about heroes, and I want to write about you. Is that okay?" When I asked him why he considered me a hero, his answer made me cry. "Because you fought for us even when we couldn't fight for ourselves. You saved us from Dad's anger, even though it took a really long time. And you never gave up on loving us, even when we said mean things about you." Chloe, now 11 and wise beyond her years, had become my kitchen assistant, learning to bake the same cookies I'd once made for her father and uncle when they were children. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I'd chosen to see it as healing rather than painful. "Grandma," she'd asked while we rolled out cookie dough, "do you think Daddy will ever get better?" It was a complex question from a child who'd lived through the destruction of everything she'd once thought she understood about family. I'd answered her with the same honesty I tried to bring to everything now. "I don't know, sweetheart. Your daddy made some very serious mistakes that hurt a lot of people, including you and your brother. But I believe people can change if they really want to, and if they're willing to do the hard work. Whether your daddy chooses to do that work is up to him." David remained in prison, serving his sentence and reportedly participating in anger management and psychological counseling programs. I'd received a few letters from him over the years, rambling attempts at apology that showed some awareness of the damage he'd caused, but little real understanding of the deeper patterns that had driven his behavior. I'd chosen not to respond to his letters, not out of vindictiveness, but because I'd learned that forgiveness didn't require me to invite toxic people back into my life. I could release my anger without reopening my heart to someone who'd proven himself capable of such calculated cruelty. Eleanor had faded into obscurity, living alone in a small apartment across the state, her social circle destroyed, and her relationship with her remaining family members permanently damaged. I occasionally heard updates through mutual acquaintances, but I'd chosen not to seek contact with her either. The choice to maintain distance from David and Eleanor wasn't about punishment. It was about protecting the peace and safety that we'd worked so hard to rebuild. Some relationships once poisoned by systematic abuse and betrayal simply couldn't be restored to health. But the relationships that could be healed had flourished beyond anything I dared to hope for during my darkest days. Standing in my garden that evening, listening to my grandchildren's laughter and Mark's gentle teasing of Lisa about her attempts to flip hamburgers, I felt a profound sense of completeness. Not because our family was perfect now, but because it was real. We'd learned to disagree without attacking to support, without enabling to love without losing ourselves. We discovered that true family loyalty meant protecting each other from harm, not covering up each other's failures. My professional reputation had been fully restored, and I'd been invited to speak at conferences across the country about family dynamics, elder abuse, and the importance of believing survivors, even when their abusers seem respectable and credible. But more important than professional vindication was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that my story was helping other families avoid the kind of destruction we'd experienced. Every time someone recognized the warning signs of parental alienation, because they'd heard me speak every time a grandparent found the courage to fight for their relationship with their grandchildren, every time a family chose truth over comfortable lies, I felt the deep purpose that had always driven my life reassert itself. As the evening wound down and we cleaned up from dinner, Ethan approached me with a serious expression. "Grandma," he said, "I've been thinking about something. Do you think you would have been happier if you just stayed quiet when Dad was mean to Aunt Lisa, if you just let it go?" I considered his question carefully. This child who'd lived through the consequences of both his father's cruelty and my decision to confront it. "No, sweetheart," I said finally. "I would have been safer in the short term, but I wouldn't have been happier. And more importantly, staying quiet would have told your father that it was okay to treat people that way. Sometimes fighting for what's right is harder than staying silent, but it's the only way things ever get better." He nodded solemnly, processing this lesson about courage and consequences that most children never have to learn so young. That night, as Mark and I sat on our front porch, watching the stars emerge, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment of peace. I'd lost years of my life to other people's cruelty, suffered humiliation and homelessness, nearly died from the stress of systematic abuse. But I'd also discovered reserves of strength I hadn't known I possessed, learned the difference between love and enabling, and found the courage to demand the respect and safety that every human being deserves. Most importantly, I'd learned that truth really does prevail, but not automatically and not without cost. Justice requires courage, persistence, and the willingness to endure temporary pain for permanent healing. As I settled into bed that night, surrounded by the quiet sounds of a home filled with authentic love, I felt the deep satisfaction of a life reclaimed, a spirit freed, and a family redeemed. Years have passed since that terrible Thanksgiving dinner that shattered my world and nearly destroyed my spirit. As I sit in my garden this morning, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of hope, I can barely recognize the broken woman I once was. My home is filled with laughter again. Mark has become the husband I always believed he could be, standing strong and protective, his courage finally matching his love. Lisa visits almost daily, bringing her own children, now a new generation, who will grow up understanding that family means safety, not fear. Ethan and Chloe, now teenagers, stop by after school for homework help and heart-to-heart conversations, our bond stronger than ever because it was rebuilt on truth rather than obligation. The woman who once cowered before her brother-in-law's rage, who accepted blame for protecting her daughter, who nearly died from the weight of others' cruelty, has been transformed into someone I'm proud to be. Not because I sought revenge, but because I chose courage over comfort, truth over peace, and love over fear. My work continues. Every week, I speak with families torn apart by manipulation and abuse. I see my own story reflected in their pain, and I'm able to offer them something precious proof that healing is possible, that truth does prevail, and that love, when it's real and healthy, always finds a way to survive. The deepest lesson I've learned is this: our greatest strength isn't in avoiding conflict, but in having the courage to confront cruelty when we see it, especially when it comes from people we love. True family loyalty means protecting each other from harm, not enabling each other's worst impulses. And sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to accept unacceptable behavior, even when that refusal costs us everything we thought we wanted. To anyone who finds themselves where I once was, facing the devastating betrayal of those who should protect them, I want you to know that your story doesn't have to end in defeat. Truth may be buried for a time, but it cannot be destroyed. Love may be wounded, but when it's genuine, it has the power to heal and renew. And courage once found becomes a flame that no amount of cruelty can extinguish. I am Barbara Morrison, and I am free.